Um, Good morning, good afternoon, depending on, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning from. My name is Gamechu Abeshu, and it is my pleasure to serve as a chair for this seminar organized by the Center for Refugee Studies at York University here in Canada. Today's seminar is titled New Pathways, Old Challenge, Navigating Labor Mobility for Skilled Refugees. This panel brings together scholars and practitioners to examine the growing use of labor mobility pathways as complementary solutions for refugees and displaced people, including initiatives such as the Canadian Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot, also known as EMPP. Today's speakers will look critically into the historical origins, the global trends, implementation challenge, and the lived experience of refugees, also called skilled migrant or EMPP, labor mobility pathways. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I'm speaking from. I am joining today from Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I acknowledge the enduring presence and the stewardship of Indigenous peoples on this land and recognize that the city is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. In terms of format of today's session, let me briefly go through. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to share their presentation. After all presentations are completed, we will open the floor to Q&A and discussion section at the end of the presentations. The order of presentation will be first, Dr. Jeff Crisp from University of Oxford will do his presentation. The title of his presentation is The Genesis and Current Implementation of Labor Mobility Pathways. That will be followed by a presentation from Sarah Walder from Talent Beyond Boundaries. She will be giving a lecture titled The Global State of Play, Trends and Innovations in Labor Mobility. The third presentation will be given by Dr. Sally Baker and Dr. Louise Olive from University of New South Wales in Australia. The title of their presentation will be Exploring Place-Based Dynamics with Skilled Refugee Mobility, Labor Mobility Reflections from Regional and Rural Australia. The fourth presentation will be by yours truly, myself. My title will be From Displaced Person to Skilled Workers with a question. Experience of labor mobility for refugee women in Canada. Last but not least, presentation will be given by Dr. Zvezda Vankova from Lund University. The title of her talk will be Refugee Labor Mobility, Empirical Insights from Europe. With that, let us begin. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the first speaker, Dr. Jeff Crisp, who is a leading scholar in forced migration refugee policy. So Dr. Jeff Crisp has been an active in the area of global refugee policy analysis for more than 40 years and has worked for a variety of organizations, including UNHCR, Refugees International, Chatham House, the British Refugee Council, and the Global Commission on International Migration. He is currently affiliated to Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center and volunteers for the NGO United Against Humanity. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Gamichu, and hi to everybody. It's great to be with you today. The European Refugee Emergency of 2015 triggered a global effort to reappraise and revise the international community's approach to large-scale movements of people across international borders. A common theme of these efforts has been a recognition by states, especially those of the global north, that such movements are more difficult to address when they take place in an unpredictable, unplanned, and disorganized manner. Rather than waiting for refugees to leave their own country in an independent manner and to claim asylum on arrival in another state, would it not be more effective, efficient, and humane to channel refugees into safe and legal routes to countries that are willing to admit them? This question has become even more pertinent over the past decade, given the growing propensity of refugees to make long and irregular journeys from their country of origin and country of first asylum, passing through a number of states before submitting a claim to refugee status in more secure and prosperous countries. Responding to this scenario, governments and international organizations such as UNHCR IOM have devoted growing attention to the establishment of programs that are additional to and different from the state-sponsored refugee resettlement operations that have been in existence since the end of the Second World War. Such complementary pathways, as they have become known, include initiatives such as community-sponsored resettlement programs, family reunion arrangements, humanitarian visas and corridors, educational scholarships for refugee students, and the topic of our discussion today, labour mobility programs for refugees with skills that are in demand in places other than their country of first asylum. And in the next few minutes, I would like to make some broad observations with respect to such labour mobility programs and their effectiveness as a means of addressing the refugee issue. First, there's a need to make a distinction between the internationally organised labour mobility programs we are discussing today and the independent efforts that refugees make to move on from their country of origin or first asylum and to enter the labour market elsewhere. For example, large numbers of people displaced by the armed conflict in Syria are known to have found employment or established livelihoods in the Gulf states. In doing so, they've been able to acquire entry visas, work permits, and business permits from governments in the Gulf and have not had to make contact with UNHCR or seek asylum in the countries to which they have moved. My suggestion is that little attention has been given to the extent to which some unrecognised and largely uncounted refugees have been able to find adequate protection and solutions by means of their own efforts, and little attention has been given to the extent to which their situation compares with those who have participated in the type of organised labour mobility programmes to which this webinar is devoted. We might want to ask ourselves, should the international community be doing more to facilitate the efforts that refugees themselves make to move on and find employment, as well of or instead of creating special labour mobility programs for this purpose? Second, while labour mobility programs for refugees have been hailed as a new and innovative approach to the refugee issue, that is not really the case. In the years after the Second World War, for example, millions of displaced refugees and displaced people were resettled from Europe to countries where their labour was needed and welcomed, including Australia, Canada, South Africa, and the USA. During this period, significant attention was given to the role that refugees could play in meeting labour market needs. But that was an approach that fell out of favour during the Cold War period, when, for ideological reasons, UNHCR and its principal donors began to make a sharp distinction between refugees on the one hand and economic migrants on the other. In the post-Cold War period, some efforts were made to question this distinction. In 2007, for example, UNHCR published a discussion paper on refugee protection and solutions in the context of international migration, which identified the many ways in which refugee and migratory movements were closely interconnected. It is evident, the paper stated, that refugee populations include people whose talents could and should be put to good use. 5 years later, UNHCR attempted to operationalize that principle, joining with ILO to hold a 2-day workshop on labour mobility for refugees, with the intention of examining, and I quote, whether and how enhanced labour mobility for refugees could increase opportunities for self-reliance and facilitate access to durable solutions without undermining international refugee law principles, end of quote. I was involved in that workshop myself, and the reaction to the proposal for the establishment of labour mobility programs for refugees was not a particularly positive one, especially from states in the global north. A Canadian delegate, for example, said that his country had a well-established refugee resettlement program and could not see what added value a labour mobility program might bring to the country's refugee policy. In a private conversation, he said to me, quote, "For years, UNHCR has been telling us to resettle the world's most vulnerable refugees, but now you're asking us to admit those with the best skills and qualifications. No wonder, he said, we are confused. Since that workshop was held almost 15 years ago, the world's most prosperous states have developed a more positive, if still somewhat cautious attitude towards labour mobility programmes for refugees. As already mentioned, following the European refugee emergency of 2015, states in the global north were increasingly receptive to the notion of channeling refugees and asylum seekers into safe and legal migratory channels. At the same time, they were beginning to experience important gaps in their labour markets and were willing to look for new sources of talent and experience, including refugees. In addition, credit must go to UNHCR and some specialised NGOs working in this area that engaged in some very effective advocacy on the issue of labour mobility. Third, and as a result of these developments, a number of states, including but not confined to Australia, Canada, and the UK, have in recent years launched small-scale labour mobility initiatives, often describing them as pilot projects. They are still at an early stage of an implementation, and our knowledge of such projects seems to be still quite limited. Academic interest in these programs has until recently been quite minimal. They have been subjected to few independent evaluations, and much of the non-academic literature on such programs has been produced by organizations that have an interest in underlining their positive impact and promoting their expansion. There is, I would like to suggest, a particular need for future research on the lived experience of refugees who have participated in labour mobility programs, a theme that is largely absent, as far as I am aware, from the existing academic literature. How did refugees get to know about these initiatives, and how did they find the recruitment process? What expectations and aspirations did refugees have on joining such labour mobility programs, and to what extent have these aspirations been fulfilled in practice? Have participants in these programs encountered any form of discrimination in the workplace, especially in terms of wages? And has adequate provision been made for them in terms of issues such as housing, education, and healthcare? To what extent, for example, have they been able to change jobs after arrival in their destination country? And what has happened to them once their contract has come to an end? Has participation in a labour mobility programme provided a smooth and secure path to long-term residency and even citizenship? I'd like to suggest that it will be perhaps unwise to proceed with the rapid expansion of labour mobility programmes for refugees without first answering these questions, and without also drawing more systematically on the experience of the governments, employers, international and non-governmental organisations that have been involved in their implementation. Fourth, in considering the case for their continuation and expansion, a number of initial observations I would like to make with respect to labour mobility programmes for refugees. On the positive side of the balance sheet, there are evident benefits to be realised from arrangements that enable refugees to make use of and expand their human capital, and to do so in a way that averts the need for them to undertake dangerous and irregular journeys to far-off countries that are hostile to undocumented arrivals. Refugees who participate in such programs are able to contribute to the prosperity of countries to which they are recruited by meeting gaps in the labour market. Above all, labour mobility programs offer individual refugees an opportunity to realise their aspirations and to escape from the frustrations that inevitably arise in protracted refugee situations, especially in those countries, of which there are many, where refugees are systematically denied access to the labour market, to land and other economic opportunities. By working, by developing new skills and earning decent wages, refugees who participate in labour mobility programs have the opportunity to support themselves and relatives that they've left behind in their country of asylum or origin, and perhaps eventually to return and contribute to the development of their homeland. In an era when the notions of international solidarity, cooperation, and responsibility sharing are under serious strain across the world, labour mobility programmes for refugees provide a practical example of the way that these principles can be put into practice. According to some commentators, for example, countries of first asylum in the developing world will be more willing to admit refugees if they know that a proportion of them will eventually move on rather than remaining indefinitely on the territory. At the same time, I'd like to suggest that there is a need to be realistic about the limitations and constraints of this approach to the refugee issue. As far as I'm aware, the available evidence suggests that labour mobility programmes for refugees might prove difficult to scale up, and that the proportion of the world's refugees who will be able to benefit from them will be quite modest. The procedures required to establish, administer, and monitor labour mobility programmes for refugees appear to be quite complex and costly, especially when calculated on a per capita basis. As currently designed, as far as I'm aware, only refugees with a good command of English or another international language will actually have access to them. And my sense is that more work is required to ensure that the qualifications gained by refugees, either in their country of origin or country of first asylum, are actually recognised by destination states. Rather than serving as an example of responsibility sharing, labour mobility programmes for refugees could also be seen as a way in which the world's most prosperous countries deprive some especially deprived communities in the developing world of their most highly skilled and best educated members. And it is for that reason that the potential for South mobility programs should be actively explored, a notion pioneered, albeit unsuccessfully, by the Organisation of African Unity more than 50 years ago. There is also, I'd like to suggest, a lack of clarity with respect to the way that labour mobility programs relate to the established conceptual, legal and normative framework for refugee protection and solutions. To what extent do the participants in such programs have an opportunity to remain, integrate and acquire citizenship in the country to which they are recruited? Do they have the right to take family members with them or to be reunited with them after a reasonable period of time? Is there a risk, as some legal experts have suggested, that refugees who have completed their employment contract in a destination country might be refused readmission to their country of asylum, or even be at risk of being sent back to danger in their country of origin? More generally, while the discourse on complementary pathways has tended to focus on the question of admission to and initial reception in destination countries, I'd like to suggest that there is a need for additional attention to be given to the longer-term resettlement process. Many refugees around the world would, I'm sure, be delighted to participate in a labour mobility programme. But unless such programmes are linked to the issue of longer-term integration, there is a risk that they will not provide the durable solutions which refugees seek and to which they are entitled. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Brilliantly presented as usual. In the interest of time, I will proceed to introducing the second presenter. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Walder. Sarah is Global Monitoring and Evaluation Lead for non-profit organization Talent Beyond Boundaries. Talent Beyond Boundaries focuses on refugee labor mobility as a complementary solution to traditional humanitarian resettlement and connect skilled refugees with companies in need of their skills while working with partners to help facilitate the recruitment, migration, and settlement. Before working for TBB, Sarah completed a mathematics BSc degree from University of Bath in 2016 and a master's in development studies from SOAS, University of London. Sarah joined TBB as a volunteer in 2020, working on the first UK program to support displaced nurses to move to the UK. She became UK project officer at the end of 2020 before moving into her role of UK and Europe monitoring and evaluation lead at the end of 2021. She was promoted to global M&E lead at the beginning of 2024, and in her current role as global monitoring evaluation lead for TBB, she is responsible for collecting and analyzing data to measure the impacts of TBB's global programs and collecting feedback through surveys, qualitative interviews from stakeholders. This supports TBB to improve programs and processes and understand challenges and opportunities for refugee labor mobility pathways. With that, I say, Sarah, the floor is yours. Please keep it to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me talk today about Talent Beyond Boundaries and our programs. So, Talent Beyond Boundaries, or TBB, is a non-profit organization that helps refugees to move abroad for work opportunities. And before I go into more details, I just wanted to introduce you to Kareem, who's on my slideshow. And Kareem was a Syrian refugee who was living in Jordan. And in Jordan, he realized that his opportunities for work were very limited. And he really wanted to be a graphic designer. This was his dream. So he did some online courses and he found a job working informally. So he was at risk of not being paid or being made to work long hours. And then one day he heard about TBB and signed up to our programs. And at the same time in London, there's a graphic design company called Good Humans who was looking to hire in London. And so we connected the two. We supported them through the interview process, through the visa process, and Kareem arrived in the UK 4 years ago. He's been thriving since then. He's been promoted in his job and he's just enjoying his life. So this is just one of the success stories of a candidate who's come through TBB's and labour mobility programs. And so we connect refugees with employers. We work with a number of partners to be able to do this. So we work with UNHCR, we work with IOM, we work with organizations who help settlement in the destination countries, so the countries that candidates move to. And we also work with Fragaman, who is a immigration law firm who help us with visas. And then on the other side with employers, we have had a number of employers who have hired refugee candidates, including Accenture, Deloitte, the NHS, an engineering firm called Enemec, and a private healthcare company called InHealth. And we also work with governments. This is also a key part of our work because often refugees face barriers to be able to move abroad. They might not have certain documents. So by working with governments to design these pathways and build on normal skilled worker pathways, we create these programs to help refugees be able to move more easily and break down barriers that they might face. So we've had nurses move to the UK and Canada. We've had engineers move to Australia, Canada. Deloitte hired some technology consultants. And yeah, so this is just a few of the occupations that have been hired. And in terms of the process is an employer-led process, which means that employers come to us with a job description and they say they're looking for a candidate with these skills and talents. And we currently have a database that we call the Talent Catalogue, which is a database of refugees' skills and experience from all around the world. Refugees sign up to our database and input all of their qualifications and skills. And so when employers provide us a job description, we then search our talent catalogue for candidates. We then support them through the recruitment process. So we support them with upgrading their CV, interview practice, and when the employer gives the candidate a job offer, we then also support them through the visa and migration process. As that's going on, we also support with integration so that we assist employers with expectations about what candidates might need when they arrive and their families. And then once candidates do arrive, we support them with regular check-ins. So we check in with the candidates and the employer in the first 12 months of their arrival. So moving on to some of our key successes. So far, over 900 displaced people have secured job offers through TBB, and over 1,200 people have relocated, and that includes family members. So for most of our programs, family members are allowed to move with candidates as well. We have over 150,000 people who are registered on our talent catalog, and this is increasing by about 1,500 people per month. So this is increasing kind of exponentially as more displaced people and refugees are signing up to the talent catalog. We've helped people located in over 30 host countries secure job offers. So countries in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. And we currently have 10 pathways open for people to move to destination countries. And I have a map on the next slide of the different countries. And another key impact and success that we found out through our surveys is that 85% of candidates who have moved are sending remittances. So on average, they're sending about $430 per month to families who are living in displacement, which is a really large amount, especially in countries like Syria or Sudan. This is a really high amount compared to the average salary. So this is also a good success. And more displaced people than this have also secured jobs through labour mobility pathways through our partner organisations, including Talent Lift in Canada and Refuge Point in Kenya. And this is a map of where all our programs. So the first destination countries that we opened up in were Australia, Canada, and the UK. And since then, we have also expanded more into Europe. So we have had people move to Belgium, Italy, and we're also opening up programs now in Slovakia, France, and Germany. So that these are the blue and green countries. And then the red countries are the host countries or countries that people were living in when they're displaced. And so these are the countries that people have moved from. And these are the countries that people have moved to, the blue ones. And some more of our key successes from our surveys, we also have a 93% candidate retention rate. So once candidates move, 93% of them are still working at the same employer after 1 year, which is a really good success. And through our employer surveys, 94% of employers said that they would hire again. They would hire a displaced person again. And I think that this really shows that once you get through the barriers and challenges, these programs really do work. And it just really speaks to how talented refugees are and how happy employers are with their skills and talents. So that's definitely a big success. And in terms, if we look at all the people who have moved, so including candidates and their family members, about 45% of them are women or girls. So it really shows the kind of gender balance of people who are actually moving through our programs. And in terms of some program-specific successes, over 250 nurses have moved to the UK to work in the NHS and private healthcare. We've had some train to hire models that this is what we call them recently, which have been really successful. And this is where we work with employers and partners in host countries to help train candidates before they move to destination countries. So they could do technical training or language training. We recently had 20 people train in Jordan as goldsmiths. So we worked with a partner here in Jordan and they trained as goldsmiths before moving to Italy. And we also have had an Italian employer give about 70 confirmed, they've promised to give 70 job offers to 70 candidates to train them in their host countries in Italian before moving to work in airports in Italy. So these specific train to hire models have been really successful in the past year. Our Australia program has been extended to June 2026. And in the UK, the displaced talent mobility pilots, we have been in discussions with the UK government and they have committed to create a permanent visa pathway for this program. So this will be the first refugee labour mobility permanent program in the world. In terms of barriers and challenges, there's definitely a lot of persistent challenges and barriers in these programs. So if we're looking from the destination side, there's a lot of currently, I'm sure everyone's aware, a lot of political volatility and anti-migrant rhetoric at the moment across countries in Europe, in the US, kind of everywhere really. And this specifically has translated to changes in visa costs and visa requirements. So even legal migration is being affected by this. And one example of this is that our program to Canada was suspended at the end of last year due to a big backlog of applications. In the US, we also had a program where 70 nurses were supposed to move to the US. And then Trump became president and cut US aid funding. So this program was cut, and only one person was able to move, which was really devastating because a lot of the people who were taking part in this program were refugees living in camps in Kenya and Uganda. So this was kind of one of their only chances to be able to leave and leave living in the camps. So it was really devastating when that program got cancelled. And in terms of family reunification, in the UK, for example, now there's been a change to the visa rules where spouses will also need to do an English test and have a specific English level, which is challenging for displaced people. And in Italy, they need to have 2 years of residence before they can bring family. So this is also challenging for candidates. There's also currently around the world quite a lot of economic challenges. There's recessions and hiring freezes. For example, in Germany, there's hiring freezes in key sectors, including IT, engineering, and pharmaceutical sector. The cost for employers has always been a huge barrier for these programs because hiring someone internationally is just expensive, paying for their visa costs, their flights, their accommodation when they arrive. So that's always been a big barrier. And also the length of time to process visas. So in the UK, for the UK pilot, we were able to get 5-day priority processing for our candidates. But in countries like Australia and Canada, it can take 6 months to a year or more. And now with the backlog in Canada, it can take even more time. So this is also a kind of persistent challenge. And even from employers themselves, they can see hiring a refugee from abroad as risky. So employers can face kind of internal bureaucracy or risk assessments, which also can make it challenging for them to hire refugees. And they can also be worried about providing integration support for the candidates. So this is also a challenge. And in terms of barriers from the candidate side, there can be volatility and ongoing crisis in host countries. So, for example, in Lebanon, we had some nurses who needed to do an English test. And because of the electricity in Lebanon, sometimes they didn't have electricity to be able to study. So some of them were sending us pictures of them studying by their phone light. And that was the only way that they were able to study for their English exam. And there was another time where the roads were closed, there were protests, and people couldn't get to the test center to be able to take their tests. So this is also a challenge. And in terms of education and language training, candidates might not have the funds to pay for these. They might not have high quality access to high quality education or language training. So this is also a challenge. And there's also a number of barriers that TBB deliberately tries to overcome and help refugees with. So one of them is if candidates are lacking documents. So for example, they might not have travel documents. This is one of the key reasons that we partner with governments, because governments can help issue travel documents. We can also help.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Can you wrap up in 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
They also might not have funds, so we're currently looking into revolving funds for candidates. They might not know about opportunities abroad. A few refugees I spoke to have said we don't even know that we can apply for jobs abroad because I'm a refugee, so I didn't even know that I was able to do that. Skills and talents of refugees aren't visible to employers abroad. And also, candidates might have gaps in their employment, which is something that we try to communicate to employers. Um, and then my last slide about emerging trends that we've seen. So the top industries that have been hiring over the last few years are healthcare, construction, and technology. And there's also been a global interest in hiring people with skills and green energy. But there's also some industries that are more specific to each country. So for example, in Ireland at the end of last year, they were really interested in hiring people in agriculture. The highest number of job offers that we had in 2025 were in Canada, Australia, and Italy. And as I was talking about the train to hire models, those have been our most successful in terms of the number of candidates who have been hired and moved. There's also something called autonomous access cases, which is where employers have a specific candidate in mind. So they might have someone who's a refugee or a displaced person that they specifically want to hire. So we just help them through the migration and the visa process and help that person actually move. And this is particularly high in Australia because in Australia, there's a big diaspora kind of connection. So the community can really help with overcoming barriers like costs and integration support and spreading the word about TBB. And also restrictions on visas are continuing in 2026. For example, Afghan nationals in the UK are now not allowed to apply for a skilled worker visa. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for presenting the excellent job that Talent Beyond Boundaries and the team is doing. So in the interest of time, I proceed to the third presentation planned for this in this seminar. This presentation is prepared by a team of two from Australia, Sally Baker and Louise. Dr. Sally Baker is a co-lead of Refugee Student Settlement Pathways and Director of University Partnerships at Skill Paths Australia and a founding CEO of Refugee Education Australia. Sally is also an adjunct associate professor of migration and education, and her work centers on policy and practice related to equity in higher education, particularly with students with forced migration background. Dr. Louise Olive is a senior research associate at Caldor Center for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. She works part-time on Australian Research Council funded project exploring skilled migration as complementary pathway for refugees in regional Australia. Louise also works as a senior policy advisor for Refugee Council of Australia, where she has been employed since 2009 and currently leads the council's work on resettlement and complementary pathways. Louise holds a PhD in anthropology and development studies from the University of Melbourne and masters in collaborative international development studies and anthropology from the University of Guelph. She is the author of Helping Familiar Strangers, Refugee Diaspora Organization, and Humanitarianism. With that, Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. It was 6 a.m. and dark when I joined this morning. I know that's not an unfamiliar time for many parents in the room, but my child is now a teenager, so it's a bit of a rude shock. And I think my eye bags tell a story. Thanks ever so much, Gamachu and everyone, for the opportunity to speak. I know that Lou is online. We flipped a coin to see who would be the speaker this morning, but obviously, Lou, if there's anything that you want to add, then we'll be very welcome. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining you this morning from the unceded lands of the Awabakal people in Newcastle, New South Wales. A beautiful part of the world, and when the geopolitics and the bombs stop flying, I would hope that many of you will come and visit us in Australia. I think we've got a great segue from Jeff's point about hearing from more alumni, as we've referred to them in our project, so people who've experienced the labour pathway in Australia, and obviously following on from Sarah, because our project, which is funded by the Australian Research Council, is in partnership with Talent Beyond Boundaries in Australia. And so we are presenting today on our project that has focused on employer perceptions primarily in regional areas. And of course, Australia, much like Canada, is a huge geographic expanse. And so that kind of notion of regionality has a particular kind of flavour, I guess, that would be different from the UK, for example, which I can confidently speak to because I'm sure you can tell by my accent that's my original home. I am very happy to be able to present on this research because we have gathered some really fascinating data, and I think this Louise's cheeky tagline here, "New pathways, old challenges?" question mark, is absolutely where we find ourselves. It's a particularly interesting time with the program as well in Australia because we're on the cusp of learning whether it will remain as a pilot or whether it will be made permanent in the migration, the Australian migration system. You might be aware that the community refugee sponsorship and integration pathway has become permanent or is about to become permanent a bit later this year. So we have seen one firm kind of footing of what are three established complementary pathways in Australia now. So community pathway, this skilled labour pathway, and the new student pathway. So our project investigates the socioeconomic and migration policy settings that inform the ability, particularly of small and medium enterprises in regional Australia, to fill skills shortages. But obviously, in terms of our kind of policy lens, we're looking as well more broadly at what this looks like. And we've spoken with Sarah about the great work they've been doing at TBB and the other report from MPRI, sorry, I've got the wrong acronym there, but that recently came out as well. So really looking to build and contribute towards that global impact study on skilled pathways, certainly from the student perspective, and I can speak a bit more about this if there's time at the end. We're also building out a large longitudinal impact study as well to track how students engage and proceed through their studies. So our project, as I said, is a partnership. It's what's called a linkage project from the Australian Research Council. It's kind of like it's a bit of a kind of it's like a hen's tooth project. Getting Australian Research Council funding is incredibly competitive, and it's somewhat hostile research funding landscape. So to get this funding and to focus on this particular topic felt like a pretty serendipitous kind of coming together of both what was a kind of fruitful policy kind of setting at the time and an interest in this. We've taken primarily an economic lens, and it sits in the economic part, but Louise and I have been focused on the qualitative research. It is a partnership between UNSW, Talent Beyond Boundaries, and the Regional Australia Institute, who, at the time of granting the project, were working on a regional migration project. And last year, Louise and I kind of bounced across Australia. And as you know, it's a large country, so this was not an insignificant data collection activity. And we have completed our qualitative data collection. We spoke to employers, a difficult group to pin down for research purposes. I think, there are many challenges in this kind of research where we want to hear from employers. We've spoken to 20 TBB alumni. So to Jeff's point, we have spoken to people who have been beneficiaries of the skilled refugee labour mobility agreement. We've spoken to employment services, so Workforce Australia and other services that are involved in job seeking or supporting job seekers in Australia. We've spoken to settlement services because obviously settlement is a key part of this, and we'll come to talk about that. And we've spoken to a large group of community stakeholders. We've done this in various ways. One of the most effective ways to gather data was to buddy up with TBB and to do regional roadshows. Some of the most effective ones were where we were able to catch the interest of local media and have it as a kind of information session and then gather data around the sites, obviously ethically and with full informed consent. But yes, we've been able to speak to many people, all from 2 sites in regional Australia and across the country. With the exception of the Northern Territory for the case studies. there's a story behind this that I can tell you if I've got time at the end. But we primarily sought to kind of look at one kind of mid-sized regional centre. So, for example, in Newcastle, where I am, this is the second largest city in New South Wales, but it is also a regional city. And then we sought to go out to a more rural kind of counterpart in the state as well. So in Queensland, I went both to Toowoomba and I went to another little town, and I can't remember the name of it to my shame. So sorry, I wish I hadn't chosen that example now. Dalby. I went to Dalby to a regional skills workshop and spoke to people there as well. And the distance between those was only 3 hours. I could have gone much further west. But to be honest, I'm not a good driver and I don't like driving when there are kangaroos around. Louise has led the alumni research and has spoken to 20 alumni who are mostly based in regional Australia. Obviously, there is a lot of people who have been settled in metropolitan areas. And just to say, as context, regional resettlement is a kind of significant government policy, but it suffers from what I imagine is an international challenge of secondary migration. And so in places like Tasmania, we went to the northwest of Tasmania. Secondary migration is a profound issue, and the council and the Regional Development Australia office and others there are really working just as a more general project at how to welcome and retain people who come, whether they're skilled workers on without refugee experience, but particularly if they were have resettlement cases through the humanitarian program. So I think Sarah's done a great job of setting out the kind of parameters of what Talent Beyond Boundaries do. The Skilled Refugee Labour Agreement is an agreement between the Australian government, the Department of Home Affairs, and Talent Beyond Boundaries. In Australia, Talent Beyond Boundaries are the trusted partner, and the process that Sarah spoke to is what happens in Australia. So there are these two kind of avenues. One is to where an employer will come to Talent Beyond Boundaries and ask for support with filling a shortage. And Talent Beyond Boundaries can go to the talent catalogue and can place. But in Australia, as Sarah mentioned, autonomous access is really a significant part of the Australian profile, and the programme is being used well by community members, often family or diaspora community members, to source jobs directly and then use the pilot, the visa pathway to secure a pathway for people who are known. So an interesting case of kind of named sponsorship of a fashion. In Australia, the pilot has 500 places. These sit outside of, and I think this is important to Jeff's point about the complementariness of pathways. The labour pathway is using an economic visa with concessions. I'll speak to those in a minute. But that means that this is truly outside of. It's the only additional complementary pathway in the suite of programs that Australia currently has. And the petition for two key kind of policy shifts that we would like to see, one being named sponsorship for community sponsorship and the other being additionality remain live points of policy advocacy. In Australia, we have a kind of loose coalition of complementary pathway actors and colleagues. So Talent Beyond Boundaries, Skill Path, who run the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway, CRISA, Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia, who run the Community Sponsorship Pathway, and then obviously Refugee Council, the Settlement Council of Australia, SSI, who are a major settlement agency, Welcoming Australia. So a kind of coalition of many people coming together on that policy point. And again, happy to speak if there's time at the end. Yeah, TBB as the facilitating organisation can help employers to identify candidates or can help to use the visa pathway as it stands for people who've identified a job already. And so there are those two kind of unofficial streams. And since it began, 230 refugees and their families, so 460 people or thereabouts, and that number may be slightly stale because obviously this is a fluid program, have already or will move to Australia. And of those, nearly 40% have moved to regional or rural areas. The main industries are around construction, manufacturing, health and aged care. There's an interesting case of nursing in the Northern Territory, which I think has probably been a little bit of a headache for everyone involved, largely because of challenges on the bureaucratic end from government, but the idea was to bring nurses in at a lower rate, so not as registered nurses, and then for their employer to help to scaffold them to over a year to meet those requirements for registration that Sarah has already kind of mentioned, including language proficiency testing and other ways of getting registered. And I believe, and Lou, you might write in the chat, that we've had 2 or 3 people now arrive in the Northern Territory. There was a commitment from the Northern Territory Health to take more people than that. 96% of the people who have come through TBB, thank you, Lou, are still in employment after 12 months, and 86 remain with their original employer. So those are pretty compelling figures for government. They tell a solid story about retention, and they tell us something about resettlement. They probably tell us something a bit more about loyalty, and so we'll kind of go into some of those, some of the findings or our insights here. The policy settings, as Sarah has already kind of laid out, they are the same because the pilot is using an economic visa. It has similar conditions in the sense that it has to offer a minimum 2-year full-time contract. It needs to be around or above the government determined salary level. There are a couple of options, but primarily the pathway in Australia has used the permanent resident on arrival pathway. Temporary skilled migration remains a significant part of the larger Australian skilled migration program. Importantly, people can migrate with partner and dependent children. Of course, what would ordinarily happen or tends to happen is that the primary applicant will come and then family will join them later, and that's what Australian employers are generally used to. So bringing the family is both a challenge cost-wise, but it's also a significant suggestion of security for employers that families are coming, and that kind of suggestion of relative stability in terms of the employment contract. Under the skilled migration pathway, refugees can access government subsidised healthcare and full-time education, so primary or secondary education, some vocational training. They do need to wait for other things, though, one of them being the 4-year wait for citizenship. So they have a pathway to citizenship after 4 years, but access, for example, to higher education is precluded because there is an anomaly in the Higher Education Standards Act, Support Act, which says that people with permanent residency cannot access the loan system, but they are eligible for discounted domestic places if they wanted to go to higher education. Importantly, of course, because it's not a humanitarian visa, refugees who come through the Labour Agreement pilot cannot access funded settlement support. So this remains a kind of challenge for the programme. The concessions include a waiver of a skills assessment, there's quicker processing time, there is a lower threshold for English language proficiency, as long as that meets the requirements of the job. There are ways of flexible arrangements with regard to documentation and to job interviewing, and over 900 occupations that are approved within the Labour Agreement, which is really exciting. So the cost is quite high. It's Australian 25,000 for the primary candidate, and then 50,000 if it's a family of 4. There are possibilities for cost sharing, but of course that is more expensive when you're talking about a family. That's just the base economics, that a primary applicant who comes and brings family later is a cheaper option. The option of bringing the whole family makes it more expensive. There are many positives. So for the refugees who've arrived in Australia, or the alumni as we refer to them, they have talked about, the wonderful safety, the rights and the possibility of a future. They've been happy to migrate through the kind of concessions in that visa. It's made them more possible, and some had tried to go through the economic pathway or other economic visa pathways previously. Having TBB as an intermediary really helps to kind of protect against some of those sharper edges of migrating and the economic visa process. and that there's a kind of sense of self-reliance. And interestingly, regional areas are seen as a soft landing by many in the cohort. For employers, it's a great way of finding motivated long-term workers. Australia relies, as many other countries do, on skilled migrants. Despite the rhetoric and the discourse about cutting migration numbers, Australia just wouldn't survive without skilled workers. And so employers know this, even if government pretend they don't. The idea of family migrating is attractive to employers again because of that sense of kind of a protective condition there with families coming and there being a kind of commitment to employers. Again, TBB as an intermediary is really helpful because there is I think one of the big things that Lou and I found in our discussions with community members and employers is that there is a significant challenge with visa literacy in Australia. There are 120 something visas in the skilled visa system. It's a difficult system to manage, and so having an intermediary like TBB is very useful. For regional community stakeholders in particular, there was a sense of this being a really exciting way of revitalising regional areas, particularly less around the humanitarian end of things, but more around the skill shortages. There are significant skill shortages in Australia that are really pressing a heavy weight on regional communities and regional employers. However, there are some challenges as well. There are too few opportunities. There are still entrenched borderline racist attitudes in some areas of Australia. The cost of living and housing in particular is a major challenge. The costs for employers, the costs are prohibitively high. They're not too high for everyone, but they are prohibitively high for small and medium enterprises. Worker fit can be a challenge. I think the notion of community, so having just one, and this is the same for skilled migrants more broadly, employers are keen to see communities develop. And for the communities themselves, many of them are not set up with the kind of arrival infrastructure that would be helpful. So in northwest Tasmania, for example, there is no mosque. There's a mobile mosque, and people would have to drive 2 to 3 hours to find a kind of non-Western food option, an Asian food store or similar. So that's a prohibitive challenge for people being able to settle and feel like they belong if they can't access things that they know. I know I'm talking to people who know this well and also work and write on this. So in summary, it's got great promise, and Talent Beyond Boundaries have made significant inroads with the government and with employers in promoting the skilled refugee labour mobility agreement as an alternative to other skilled migration pathways. However, I think we can agree that this is now 5+ years in the making. So some of the shininess of the pathway have waned, and there has been slow uptake. Largely, I think from my observation, because of inconsistent communication from government and employers not understanding the difference between a broader set of visas in the first place and then finding it difficult to kind of land where this sits. There are also many skilled temporary migrants in regional areas, because that's a condition of one of the skilled temporary visas, who are also pressing on local services, especially workforce providers. So there is a sense also that there's a need to address that cohort before thinking about new cohorts. Not consistent, but that is in the mix. So we found that there is an appetite, but to make it more scalable and to kind of really put this into a kind of longer term and fruitful permanent program, employer needs and concerns need to be taken into account, particularly where it comes to high costs and retention. Local communities need, and this is more broadly the case for regional resettlement, there needs to be an investment in arrival and settlement infrastructure, and different models of settlement might work in different places. So those need to be modelled and costed and considered. As we've said, there is a kind of general issue with the way that skilled migrants are perceived, despite them being entirely necessary and vital to Australia's economic and social fabric to date and in the future. And so there is a kind of education piece that's needed with many parts of community. I think I'll stop there. Kimchi?
Thank you, Sally. I know I've listened to your project before, but always interesting to listen again. So now the turn is mine. To reintroduce myself, my name is Gamechu Abeshu. I am currently a postdoc fellow at McMaster University, but I'm also a research affiliate at the Center for Refugee Studies here in Canada. My research interest the last 4 or 5 years has been around refugees, refugee integration. The last 2 or 3 years around labor mobility pathways for refugees. I will be presenting from a pilot project funded by York University's Black Scholars Research Fund, and since then I've got a research grant from SHARC, that is the Canadian Social Science and Humanity Research Council, to look into, in an expanded way, into the experiences of labor mobility pathway participants, in the Canadian case, the EMPP. I'm also interested in Black diaspora experiences, and over the last few years as well on the experiences of scholars at risk. And I will speak a little bit later on the workshop we are organizing end of this month. With that, I will share my screen. Okay, so the title of my presentation, as I indicated before, is From Displaced Person to Skilled Worker, Experience of Labor Mobility Pathway for Women in Canada. I have to note there are co-PIs and research teams, some of whom are already in the room. If they have additional information to give, there will be an opportunity for that. So by way of introduction, just basics, the points that you already know. As of end of last year, June last year, there were around 170 million displaced people globally. Currently, in my reading, there are more than 120 million globally displaced people. And the labor mobility pathway emerged, as most of you said, as a complementary pathways to the traditional resettlement pathways. The labor mobility pathway, when it was introduced, was supposed to offer displaced people with employment that match up with their skill and resettlement in destination countries, and in a way provide a win-win-win for the transition countries who are shouldering the majority of the responsibility of hosting refugees, for the host countries who are looking for skilled labor, and for the refugees themselves to get safety and employment. The Canadian Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot launched in 2018, and with the arrival of the first person from Syria in 2019, based on the stat that I have as of now, close to 1,000 people have arrived, and the program is currently suspended, and it's currently under review whether to make it a permanent program or to expand it. And when it was designed, it was aimed at creating a pathway to connect skilled refugees and displaced people with job opportunities in the Canadian labor market. And this program was designed and introduced under the leadership of the government, of course, but in collaboration with international and non-government actors, including UNHCR, Talent Beyond Boundaries, and Refuge Point. As I stated earlier on, so my presentation today is based on a pilot project we did. And because it was a pilot, we did around 16 interviews. Out of the 16 interviews, 11 were women who came through the EMPP program. And to make sense of the data that we had to draw on 3 interrelated frameworks, theoretical frameworks. The first one is theories of belonging. And actually, again, we were working on this as a team, we developed a concept of belonging negotiation strategy to explain why skilled migrant women may minimize or normalize discrimination while navigating work and social life in Canada. And this belonging navigation framework or belonging navigation strategy draws on 3 interrelated complementary theories. The first one is belonging and theories of belonging. Anderson's concept of imagined communities shows us that nations are socially constructed through shared cultural norms and expectations. In practice, belonging is often shaped by dominant cultural standards such as language, accent, behavior, and appearance. This project uses this perspective to show how skilled migrant women navigate expectations of fitting in within the Canadian workspace and within the wider society, particularly through judgment about accent, professionalism, and cultural competence. The second perspective comes from affective and emotional labor theory. Women working in care and health sectors are expected to manage emotions, remain professional, and maintain positive relationship with their partners, patients, and colleagues. And this study uses emotional labor theory to understand how skilled migrant women manage workplace interactions, including microaggressions, in ways that protect their professional roles and employment stability. The third perspective comes from intersectional feminist theory, which highlights how race, gender, immigration status intersect and interact to shape people's experiences. Skilled migrant women navigate workplaces as racialized professionals, as women, as immigrants/refugees, because there is a tendency to mix, and which can increase their vulnerability to discrimination while also limiting their ability to challenge it directly. So this study uses intersectionality to analyze how those overlapping social markers of identity shape both the risks and strategies involved in negotiating belonging. So I have already alluded to this. So my presentation today is part of a bigger pilot, but this study focuses on 11 women working in a care and healthcare sector. Our interview participants come from Africa and Asia, including from Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and from Asia, including Syria, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. And we followed an abductive approach in our analysis, i.e. we tried to make sense of the data that we have by bringing in the theoretical perspectives I just highlighted. Findings. There are very good positive outcomes we got from interview participants. The obvious one being after years and years of protracted displacement, some of them spent 10 years, 16 years, 17 years in transition country. Now they have found a safety in a third country with a very clear pathway, immigration pathway, because they come with a permanent residence and a permanent residence handed to them upon arrival. And in terms of labor market, 2 out of the 11 interviewed experienced career advancement from nursing assistant to nurse. I have to note the demography of interview participants. Most of them have degree and above. There is one medical doctor. There are 5 or 6 nurses, and others have college diploma and 1 high school graduate. And except one, coincidentally, all of them work in the care and healthcare sector. And 2 out of the 11 experienced career advancement from nursing assistant to nurse, and 10 out of 11 were still with the employer that brought them to Canada. And also on the positive side, I have to note, they talk about how workplaces are actually a very positive and a stepping stone to integrating to the wider society. They found support, they found friendship, they found encouragement at workplaces, which helped them to actually socialize better in their neighborhood, in the wider society. And yet, these experiences demonstrate labor mobility pathways are embedded in contexts that often undervalue and de-skill them. I can give an example of a family physician from Afghanistan who is working as a personal support worker and in Canada, which requires high school plus 6 months of training. And most of them have similar experiences here. Our interest in this project was to look into their experiences of integration, their experiences of belonging beyond their labor market integration, beyond their positive labor market outcomes. And one of the the highlight is that in comparison, EMPP skilled women participants from Africa are more likely to talk about anti-Black racism, accent-based discriminations in the workplace, but also in their daily life. And one of the striking things for us, was the way in which they normalize and minimize their experiences of discrimination. And that was stated as a coping mechanism, partly to make sure that their jobs are safe, their jobs are protected, but also to try to accommodate as a professional, not to be seen to be emotional. And so they narrate as if those are small instances that we have quotations and quotations with regards to this. And they narrate it as if these are small instances, minor encounters, not major incidents. And they do several coping strategies to deal with the discrimination that they face. There is one participant who had to change her place of work, her employment, to a place where she felt will be safer and better for her. Others try to reach out to friends and peers for support. There are incidents where they talk about how they Google to try to see how to cope under such circumstances. With that, and I rushed through because we are going over time, I will pause here. I will be very happy to talk in detail later on in the question and answer section. Thank you. I will pause here and go back to my chairing role. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Zvezda Vankova. Dr. Vankova is, let me stop sharing. Associate Professor in the EU Migration Law at the Law Faculty of Lund University and the Principal Investigator of the project Refugee Protection or Cherry Picking. Assessing new admission policies for refugees in Europe, funded by the Swedish Research Council. The overarching aim of her research is to examine how the interaction of laws pertaining to human mobility and their implementation in practice influence the rights and trajectories of people on the move. More specifically, her research interest lies at the intersection of EU law, public international law, and empirical legal studies with a focus on human rights, migration, integration, and complementary pathways for refugees. Dr. Zvezda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to actually be able to participate, but it's almost like 9:30 here in Denmark, so please bear with me. I'm getting a little bit tired as a mom of a toddler. What I've decided to do today is actually to draw from all my work on refugee labor mobility, because as I'll tell you, the current project, we're still analyzing the data. We've actually still coding the data. So I'll be drawing from my postdoctoral project, which focus on feasibility of refugee labor mobility. So I believe it was one of the first ones to really look into what this means in terms of legal and policy terms and what it entails in terms of feasibility. And I had two case studies, one in Sweden and one was Sweden and one was Germany. The current project that Gemeshu mentioned is a larger project which looks into complementary pathways, both needs-based and skills-based. So actually, refugee labor mobility is just one small component of it. And as I said, we're still working on data analysis. So I'll share some preliminary data with you, some preliminary findings. And the last one, the last project has just been published probably like a week ago, and that was a policy study commissioned by a Swedish delegation for migration studies, Tell Me, and it looks into opportunities, challenges, and added value of designing legal pathways for both migrants and refugees into Sweden. So a lot of things have been said already, so I won't repeat. I'll just build on what other speakers have already said, but just maybe to say a few things about how these pilots or complementary pathway or refugee labor mobility pathways come into being. It's basically, of course, we need to have employers with foreign labor needs. We need to have states willing to remove barriers for refugees by introducing some waivers or facilitation measures. Other speakers have talked about that. We need to reach out to potential beneficiaries and identify suitable ones and match them with potential employers. We also need national partner coalitions with different actors that have relevant roles. And here, of course, international NGOs such as TBB or Pathways International have really played a big role into bringing these coalitions together. And then we need some sort of a pilot project or proof of concept, usually focusing on specific sector, which we have seen it's a very good workable solution in most of the cases to basically test the conditions on national level and show what needs to be adjusted in terms of legal frameworks and other such specificities in the national context. And of course, all this needs to happen with regard to the existing protection safeguards and meaning human rights standards and rights guaranteed by international EU law. I think I don't need to say to give more details to this audience, but we can of course talk about this in the Q&A if there's time. So I wanted to say a few words about the specificities when we talk about admission into the EU, because I don't think people realize how complicated it is from the perspective of someone who's not an EU citizen. So basically, we have our shared competence between the EU member states and the EU, which means that the migration landscape consists of both EU instruments and national instruments. So depending on where you want to enter or under what type of status, you might face different rules and different challenges. And there are actually a lot of requirements even for highly skilled and even for people who are falling under now the so-called blue card directive, which has been recasted recently to facilitate access for highly skilled people. We haven't really seen, when it comes to skill-based pathways and refugee labor mobility in particular, we haven't really seen any EU legal action. So actually there has been mostly technical and financial support and different policy tools, which meant that what we have seen across the EU is some national small-scale schemes. And Italy has been actually given as a really like a laboratory for refugee labor mobility, which is actually one of the case studies for the current project. So having done several projects, I can somehow go back and look into what has worked and what has changed. So it was very interesting that when I started working on this topic back in 2019, I talked to a lot of stakeholders in Germany and Sweden, which were the countries actually attracting most of the refugees in Europe at that time. And I thought that these two countries would be prone to attracting and experimenting with this new complementary pathways tools by using labor migration. And back then, both stakeholders in both countries are quite skeptical. We see now, several years later, this has changed. Germany has actually somehow opened up to more labor migration in general by liberalizing their laws. And we also see that there will be pilots involving refugees. And Sweden, on the other hand, has really been going towards a more restrictive approach to migration in general and asylum in particular. And the rules that have been working for refugees to use on a spontaneous in a spontaneous way have actually been really made in more restrictive, so people cannot come spontaneously from refugee producing countries. And it also seems that currently it's not politically feasible to start any specific pilots. What I think a lot of the existing challenges have already been mentioned. I'll just add that I think employers' perceptions have been a very big issue. For example, in Sweden, they really don't understand the added value of actually hiring refugees from first countries of asylum. And I can tell you more if there's time in the Q&A. But yeah, other things have been mentioned, so I won't repeat just to save some time. I think what all my research is pointing to is that there's been a focus on admission. So I'm focused on bringing people to host countries, and not on post-arrival and long-term prospects. And I think several people has mentioned that. And we really see it when we talk to people, because this is what I forgot to mention, that we've actually made like 11 or 12 focus groups with refugees. And one of them was with people who have just arrived through refugee labor mobility pilots in Italy. So we will now do a second focus group with them in May to follow up on integration prospects. But we could really see that at some point, people are just left on their own devices, and actually, we don't know how their trajectories will end. And again, because we have left the refugee law domain and we are in the migration law domain, it really matters how you enter, on what type of status, on what type of permit you're admitted, and this has consequences for your whole trajectory, and for the prospects of durable solution, and for the rights, because rights, of course, are attached to particular statuses. And we see lots of variations across countries and pilots, of course. And someone who enters Canada or Australia and receives a permanent residence upon arrival is in a very good position compared to someone who comes to EU member states, where permanent residence can be gained on average only after 5 years. And one needs to be on a special permit that usually allows for accumulation of residence periods that would qualify you for such a long-term status. So this is a very big problem in Europe, I would say. Another problem that has been mentioned is, of course, the rights attached to particular statuses. So, for example, family reunification for refugees with refugee status will be facilitated. Family reunification for migrant workers can be limited in some cases. And as one of the participants in the refugee labor mobility focus group mentioned, it cannot be a home without your family. So actually this would become a problem when they establish themselves in the country and start thinking about the next steps, how to turn this new country into a family. And then maybe just a few words on durability. And here I'm also drawing on my previous research that I mentioned to you. So as it was already mentioned here, because we are in the migration law domain, permanent residence and citizenship are not given. So one really needs to have, as one of my interviewees said, an incredibly manual approach to a case to ensure they go from A to B to C. So really making sure you're picking the right migration statuses and permits. Also making sure you can transition from one status to another. hoping that the country where you end up actually allows you to stay unemployed for a particular reason, for a particular period of time, so you actually can look for another job or employer. Or if you're lucky enough to have actually benefited from a European status, European migration status, benefiting from some sort of migration within the EU. Another way to actually ensure durability, it seems, is the use of vocational and technical and vocational educational trainings. This is now, I think Sarah mentioned this, if I'm not mistaken, this is becoming a very successful tool where people are actually trained in the first countries of asylum and matched to employers, and this seems to be working very well. And then if everything else fails, of course, if people cannot manage to secure residence or another employment, of course, there should be the access to asylum always as a safety net. This is what we are all hoping, right? But what we see now, and I hope to, we have several cases now, and I hope to be able to write something about this very soon, is that sometimes it seems that there are limited chances for successful claims after people have entered through labor migration visas. So it's really important to actually write and talk about these issues and see whether actually the safety net that we're all talking about exists, or actually governments are curtailing this right. And because I don't want to end on a negative note, I also wanted to say that having talked to finally to so many beneficiaries, not only of refugee labor mobility, but also other skills-based pathways, I heard a lot of positive stories and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of grateful people for these opportunities that to actually end their displacement and to be able to work and build a new home. And yeah, and I think that's why I really think it's important to talk to people and to the beneficiaries to actually hear their opinion, because I feel that very often we forget to include them, or we fail to include them in these conversations, and they give us the best feedback on the way to go. Thank you very much. I'll end here.
Thank you, Zvezda. Thank you very much. So, our listeners, you've heard Jeff gave us a speech on the genesis and the current implementation of the labor mobility pathways, followed by Sarah's take on the global state of play. TBB is a global actor operating in so many countries around the world in implementing the labor mobility pathways in different countries in the world today. And then Sally and Louise gave the perspective from Australia, implementation of a project. I gave our pilot finding from a pilot project we conducted here. And finally, Dr. Vankova gave perspective from Europe. Now, I will leave the door open to questions and discussions. I have one already, and I will read that.